So I'm really honored to have this amazing panel that is coming out of the health freedom movement. I think all of these people have been in that movement for many years, and so each will bring a slightly different perspective. So I'm going to start with Leslie Manookian. And Leslie, tell us about your work both at the state level and with Health Freedom Defense Fund.
So Health Freedom Defense Fund is the organization that defeated, thank goodness, the federal travel mask mandate. So you don't have to wear a mask on an airplane, train, or bus because of us. And we have a huge lawsuit against the Los Angeles Unified School District as well right now, which already at the Ninth Circuit put a dent in Jacobson. Jacobson is the lawsuit, the Supreme Court case from 1905 that's been used to justify vaccine mandates ever since 1905. They're still using that. None of us could vote in 1905, but they still think that that's appropriate law today. One of my goals is to overturn that at some point, and our case against the Los Angeles Unified School District has already put a dent in it and has real potential. I've believed since the beginning that it would make history, and I'm still very, very hopeful about that. But more recently, we've scored a huge win in the state of Idaho. So Health Freedom Defense Fund, I founded only in 2020, and I did so because I had been involved in the whole vaccine safety arena for a long time. I made a documentary film, award-winning documentary film called The Greater Good, which came out in 2011. And it was through the process of making that film that I really began to appreciate and understand the importance of each and every one of us having medical autonomy. And when 2020 unfolded, I knew within a few days, literally in early January of 2020, that what was happening wasn't about a public health crisis, but about maybe a re-engineering of society, an authoritarian response to a public health, to the pretext of a public health crisis, I think, more than anything. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the legislation for the last 20 years, we had the Patriot Act, then the Model State Emergency Health Powers Act legislation, which accords extraordinary powers to state health departments and governors in the event of a public health emergency. You had the PrEP Act in 2005. You had the suspension of the Smith-Mundt Act and the National Defense Authority Authorization Act of 2012, which meant that it was no longer illegal for the US government to disseminate inaccurate information to the American public. They were allowed to propagandize abroad up until that point, but not domestically, and then that changed. And all these things facilitated an inappropriate response. Anyway, so I started Health Freedom Defense Fund because I knew what was happening and I wanted to fight back. And we've sued the federal government repeatedly, and our whole mission is to establish a societal norm of medical autonomy. Each and every one of us knows what's best for us. Each and every one of us knows our medical backgrounds, and each and every one of us has to live with the consequences of our choices. No one, no employer, no school, no bureaucrat, no state entity should have the power or authority to tell us what to do with our bodies. So that's my mission at Health Freedom Defense Fund, to establish that as a societal norm and to codify it in law. And I am absolutely thrilled to share that on April 4th of this year, the governor of Idaho signed the Idaho Medical Freedom Act, which prohibits medical mandates in the state of Idaho for almost every single person. It's truly landmark legislation which puts the power back in the hands of the people, so that no human being has to worry about, be coerced or forced into taking a medical intervention in order to live a normal life. And what we're now doing is working on creating a model bill out of it and a package of information, a sort of a legislative how-to. We're going to roll that out to other states, and we're going to make America free again.
Thank you, Leslie. Great. Amy Villela-McBride, and with a lot of different backgrounds and things to contribute. So tell us.
So my name is Amy Villela-McBride. I worked for a period of time at Children's Health Defense, and now I'm with the Global Wellness Forum. So we're a brand new nonprofit in policy reform, legislation, education, and outreach. I started my activism in the state of New York when I used to live there by forming the New York Alliance for Vaccine Rights back in 2015. So I watched California lose their exemption rights and thought, well, this is going to happen here soon in New York. And at the time, I was working full-time in Manhattan, a big global ad agency, and I couldn't imagine multiple kids, how do I homeschool if our rights are taken away? So I worked for many years to protect state rights in the state of New York. Sadly, we did lose our exemption in 2019, but that allowed me to understand kind of legislation and state leaders and how to really make impact with policy and our legislation body. Now with the Global Wellness Forum, that was founded by Sayer Ji, who's with Green Med Info, Dr. Ed Group, who's with Global Healing Company, Amazing Supplements, and Marla Maples. We are focused on creating these councils or think tanks, and we're working at the local level, at the county level, at the state level, at the federal level, and at the international level. So we're partnered with many of the groups here to really kind of amplify the great work that's already happening with all the grassroots organizations. We work very closely with Stand for Health Freedom on a lot of different advocacy projects and different work. And the big win we just had was in the state of Florida. So we just became the very first state in the country to criminalize weather modification and geoengineering activity. This bill now makes it a felony activity, punishable up to 5 years in prison and a $100,000 fine per incident. And there's actually 34 other states that have similar proposed legislation. Tennessee was the first state to pass it last year, but did not have any level of enforcement or penalty or crimes. So we kind of took it a step further. Our bill isn't perfect in the state of Florida. We kind of wanted, a little further, even stronger enforcements, but we did what we could. And right now I'm also working on a MAHA Florida Freedom Executive Order package that we're going to be delivering to DeSantis. We had a very short legislative session this year. It was only about 60 days, so it was very difficult to get any bills passed. But we had a number of excellent health freedom MAHA bills that sadly just didn't get through the legislature, and we're going to serve them back up to at least get some temporary reprieve on things like not discriminating against families who choose not to vax. You can get kicked out or not even accepted at many pediatrician offices. That unfortunately didn't pass. We have an excellent transparency and food labeling bill that would allow forced disclosure of any vaccine components in food and also in health and beauty products. There's a number of great bills that we had hoped would pass this session that didn't, so we're working on that next. And we're also going to create a grassroots advocacy toolkit on the weather modification geoengineering that we can then give to all the states so we can really scale this. So it's going to have model legislation, list of considerations, The Dimming, which is a wonderful documentary film that's done by Dane Wigington. So we're going to have kind of a film guide, how to hold screenings, and education outreach materials as well. And another big win we had was that Florida was the second state in the country to ban fluoride. So following on the heels of Utah, we also did that in Florida. So all public drinking water will no longer have fluoride, and working hand in hand with a lot of our groups on a lot of future initiatives as well down the road. So we're just getting started. We're new, globalwellnessforum.org if you'd like to learn more about us. We just got started in January, but we've been in this space for the last 15, 20 years plus.
Great. Amy, thank you so much. So next, Leah Wilson from Stand for Health Freedom. Tell us what you've been doing across the country in this health freedom space.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mary. And for those of you I haven't had the chance to meet, I recognize a lot of the faces in the room, and it's an honor to be together at this time of such exciting reform and expectation to really turn things around with radical transparency. So for those of you I haven't had the chance to meet, I started Stand for Health Freedom in 2019 along with our co-founders, Dr. Joelle Bohemier and Sayer Ji, because at that point in time, there's a lot of reasons people join the medical freedom movement, but our family had had our foster care license removed by the state of Indiana for not vaccinating our biological children. And I knew that didn't make sense with my background in law and our natural health center, so we fought this all the way up the chain of command to say there's no new law, there's no new policy, there's no new regulation. What has changed since our last foster care placement that our home is no longer fit to care for these children who are currently sleeping on the floor at DCS waiting for a family. And they didn't have answers, of course, and my husband and I and our co-founders said, this is too big to fight, but it's also too big not to fight, because we know that when the people have the information, these bad policies will not prevail. And so we set out to form a large and growing voting bloc for health freedom, to give the people the voice, to put the power back in the hands of the people when it comes to public health policy. And you know, it goes without saying that we've lived through some pretty exciting times, because at inception in 2019, the people very rarely had a seat at the table when it came to public health policy. And most of them didn't even know that they would want a seat at the table regarding public health policy. But after living through the COVID era in the last 5 years, we've grown to almost 1 million very actively engaged advocates who have used their voices and helped us come together and create policy and influence policy, mostly on a state level, but also on a local and national level, for health freedom, parental rights, informed consent, privacy, religious freedom, and free speech. So that's the space that we exist in, and we eat, sleep, and breathe policy. We educate people so that they can care about the policy, and then we give them the tools to use their voice and have a say in what happens in their own local schools, or with their own water or air, or the ability for a parent to be actively engaged in the decision-making of their child's health. Everything that we do at Stand for Health Freedom comes from the informed consent premise. You know, we're not here to argue the science, even though we greatly appreciate the experts that we get to work with. But coming from a constitutional perspective, we believe that every individual has the right to access unbiased information and make decisions based on that. And number two, that every individual has the right to access the form of care that they choose, whether that's conventional or holistic, and that all those medical decisions should be kept private and never used against you. So that's where we come from with our policy perspective. And I know that our founding fathers understood that and put an infrastructure in place, that if we can have an educated people and a people with a voice, that together we can turn this around. And we are seeing those wins. I mean, Bobby being in office is one of those wins, that we all came together and used our voices and sent over 150,000 emails to Congress saying that he is the right choice, that we all are voting for the radical transparency that he's already delivering on in a big way.
Thank you, Leah. Are there any key objectives that you're working on right now for Stand for Health Freedom?
Yes. So 3 of the big ones that are still active that we have wins on, and we're moving the ball down the field. One of those is making it very clear and exposing that the WHO and other global entities have garnered far too much power that directly affects our sovereignty on a national, state, and local level. And we have empowered people to take over 630,000 actions on the WHO issues and exposing the pandemic treaty. And we're very thankful for President Trump taking a big step on a national level to help us exit the WHO. And we've had states that have passed, yes. We have states that have passed legislation to say that these globalists do not have authority in their own backyards, and we're continuing to educate on that issue. Another big issue is, if we want our children to be healthy, we will listen to and empower the parents. And there's a few trends that are extremely detrimental to parental rights. One of those is more longstanding from the health freedom perspective, and that is lowering the age of consent. Maryland brought a bill a few years ago, a lawmaker did there, to lower the age of consent to 11, and regardless of need or capacity, you know, special needs children could have this consent, but they could not say no, but they could say yes. It just was complete nonsense. And we helped take that piece of legislation to the media with our state director and Informed Consent Maryland, and also sent tens of thousands of emails directly to the State House there. And the next day, it was only one day after we had really turned on those efforts full throttle, the bill died. And so we continue to expose the issues of lowering the age of consent. And kind of adjacent to that is the privacy rights that are being prioritized for our children. And we want parents to understand what their rights are to access their child's information, because once they turn 14 in any given state, it shouldn't be that we're locked out of a child's information. A third big one right now is we are looking at school-based health centers still. We uncovered that issue a few years back and helped elevate that. Parents, we have a lot of work to do to fully restore parental involvement in medical decisions without threat of state involvement. And the parental rights issues that come under attack because of school-based health centers are that, okay, the industry came forward in New Jersey and in West Virginia and other states and said, we're coming after religious parents. We'll ice out the religious parents, we'll take away religious freedom so that you have to comply. And that didn't work. Grassroots sent them home. And now they're saying, we'll just go around the parents. We'll just go directly to the children in their trusted places where children spend every day. And it's not common knowledge that when you sign a global consent form with your admissions packet, that your child will have access to a variety of providers without your additional knowledge or notice. So the school-based health center issue is something that HHS could have a huge influence on, because it's being funded. Millions of dollars are being funneled into our states by not only HHS, but also by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and their School-Based Health Center Alliance, which, great news, the School-Based Health Center Alliance canceled its annual conference this year because of lack of funding. And the Trump administration cut off funding to mental health care in schools. So we've seen a lot of traction on these issues.
Thank you, Leah.
Can I say something on this?
Very briefly, because I want to say
important.
time for now. Yeah.
There are certain ways that the federal government controls what the states do, right? And so this program that you're talking about is one of those. But it's really important that people understand that the U.S., that we were all gifted the greatest gift of all, which is 50 states. That was the safeguard against utter tyranny in this country in the last 5 years. That's why we didn't become Britain or Australia or Canada, because we had the 50 states. And the state level is where we can actually really push back, where we can actually show the path. And so the Idaho Medical Freedom Act, which we want to share elsewhere, this is a model for other states to do this very thing. We can change this. 5,000 parents showed up in Los Angeles and said, we're not going to vaccinate our kids with the COVID shot, no matter what you do, and the school board backed down. We had thousands of people communicate with the governor and the legislature when we passed the Idaho Medical Freedom Act, and there were a lot of shenanigans and betrayals. We won because of engagement, and that's where we're going to win this battle, is at the state level, and we don't want to yield that ground because it is the thing that protects us. So be very, very careful what you wish for. I hear people all the time say, oh, we need a federal solution. That's the last thing I wish for.
Thanks.
And 80% of our work is on the state level, and we have 41 state directors. We worked closely with Leslie to help support her efforts and give people a voice on that. And it's been exciting to see the grassroots win over and over again if we show up consistently with a common sense, informed consent message. In Florida was a huge win of sending the industry home with fluoridating our water. And even there was a holdout in Miami. We had won, I think it was 17 cities in a row, and then went to Miami. They passed 8-2. The commissioners there in Miami-Dade said, we want fluoride out of the water, 8-2, common sense decision. And the mayor vetoed it. And we then, in between coming back to override the veto, which was accomplished, Florida passed a state law for a statewide ban on fluoride that would take place in July. So the effective date of much legislation, if it's emergency effectiveness, it could be as early as that July after the piece of legislation passes, and that's what they did with this specific legislation. And they went back and overrode the mayor's veto and sent her home empty-handed. And the exciting thing was, following that, we had 4 counties email us, reaching out saying, we're also going to go ahead and cut off the fluoride tap in our town. And one of those counties even said, reporting into Stand for Health Freedom, that we're going to reallocate the dollars that are spent on fluoride to filters to get out other contaminants in our city's water.
Thank you. So, thank you, Leah. So Yes, the grassroots action at the state level and county and local level is critical. So I want now to turn the floor to Dr. Meryl Nass, who's been involved in many organizations in many different ways. And Meryl, you have a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, thank you. My talk is going to be different than everybody else's. I'm going to jump around to about 5 topics, particularly the World Health Organization, the UN, gain of function, which Trump has just banned with an executive order, and finally a tiny bit about food and farming. And I'm going to put the slides up on my Substack because we're going to go over them very, very fast. So people wonder what has been going on at the World Health Organization and the UN in the last 3 years. And what is, here we feel like we're regaining freedom. Trump is president. We have good secretaries. But what about the rest of the world? What about the European Union, Australia, Canada, England, New Zealand? They are basically clamping down more on freedom of speech, destroying their farming industries more than they already have, blaming cows for methane production and climate change, and destroying their energy industries, going for so-called renewable energy, which just means that when the solar panels are built in China, we don't see what kind of pollution they're causing. Or similarly, when the lithium is being mined somewhere else, we don't deal with the child miners. Okay, so what happened is that the pandemic was used, and I happen to think it was deliberately caused, but maybe it wasn't. It may have been a lab leak, may have been many lab leaks. But it was used in order to centralize control by some elites. We don't even know exactly who they are, although we can make pretty good guesses that they're members of the Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, and the Bilderbergers. So those top people. And of course, the World Economic Forum as a sort of publicity organization for them. They took over basically the World Health Organization and the United Nations and created model treaties, 3 of them. One was existing, but it was massively amended, called the International Health Regulations, and then created also a pandemic treaty, and then the UN created something called a Pact for the Future. And yes, they did allow nation representatives to help write these documents, but basically they were spearheaded by the bureaucracies within these organizations to produce what the elites wanted. And this is a summary of what the 2 treaties at the WHO were trying to accomplish. They did want global governance, at least in terms of public health. The Director General could declare pandemics at will. They wanted to impose a crazy idea called One Health, which says that animals and the environment are equally as important as humans and need to be considered in all decisions about humans and their health. They wanted to get rid of licensing so they could roll out vaccines within 100 days for the next pandemic. They wanted to get rid of liability for manufacturers, because that's the only way you can make that work. They definitely wanted everyone to believe that this pandemic and every other is caused by natural zoonotic spillover. And they created a system for building a library of potential pandemic pathogens. So anything that could cause a pandemic, they wanted captured, sent to the WHO, which would then share it with research centers, manufacturers, nations, and anyone else they thought was reasonable, so that they could spread these things widely. And the idea was that, okay, we can make drugs and vaccines quickly if any of them ever do cause a pandemic. That didn't go over. Now, the health regulation amendments were 95% rejected. The pandemic treaty couldn't be finished, and so it has now been moved to this month when the WHO meets in a few days, and they've tried to create a document that leaves all the important decisions for the future. So if you sign up to the pandemic treaty, then there will be other annexes and a conference of parties that will decide everything important later. Now, because there was so much problem getting this pandemic pathogen lending library established, the WHO decided to go around its own membership and create its own lending library. And so it built it with an agreement with the government of Switzerland. The WHO is centered in Geneva. A few miles away, the Swiss government had a high containment lab, and they have started creating the pathogen lending library. They have many specimens of SARS and of monkeypox, and a year ago they said, we will soon be welcoming new pathogens in. Okay, so this is going on. This is the US has a program when we have these about 65, infectious, dangerous microorganisms. If you have an accident or you want to transfer them to somebody else, you have to actually report and get permission from the CDC. This is the latest report that is online. In 1 year in the US, just working on these 65 pathogens, there are 8 reports of losses, 215 releases, accidents. One person, a lab worker, caught tularemia from something they were working on, and the FBI was notified of 16 incidents to investigate. That's the US alone. The rest of the world is doing this too. So it is a problem, and it's not obviously being regulated in a way most of us would like. This is what happened when President Trump issued his executive order. And I've written this detailed description of what he did. It's a long executive order because it's been, I think, misrepresented by many people on social media. Basically, creating the right language to stop dangerous gain-of-function experiments is not simple, and creating verification measures while still allowing reasonable scientific research to go on is complicated. And so what this did was basically give the agencies time, up to 6 months, to develop policies and allow them to work with scientists and others to come up with something that is reasonable. It's not that there's a delay, and although there can be waivers, every waiver has to be reported to a government agency and reviewed. So this is a much better, much better policy than what we had during the Biden administration and before, but it's not a completed policy. It's the beginnings of a mechanism for controlling this. Obviously, you can't control lab-made pandemics unless you stop them in the whole world. So this is simply a blueprint for what will need to be developed for everywhere else. We have one of those called the Biological Weapons Convention, which was developed by the United States and Britain initially, came into force in 1975, but it was never completed. Like the pandemic treaty at the WHO, they said we're going to leave the hard parts for later, and then the United States blocked them later. So it's not a workable treaty, but it can be made workable if these kinds of measures are added to it. What did the UN do? They ran this Pact for the Future, which was voted on. Again, they couldn't get what they wanted through, so they got a very watered-down version passed, but it showed us what they sought. So again, they wanted information control, they wanted global governance, the Sustainable Development Goals, and something they won't explain exactly what they mean, they want a new global financial architecture. But you can be worried about that. Luckily, Trump has reduced UN funds by 87%, and the UN, as well as the WHO, is scrambling right now to fire people and reduce the size of their agencies. The WHO has lost about 40% of its funding, maybe more. And, hello, Sarah. We don't know exactly how much the UN will lose. This is the day after they passed the Pact for the Future last September. This was a press release from the UN, and they say it was transform global governance. So you don't have to query, what are they doing? We know what they're doing. What did they achieve? Not a lot, except, again, a blueprint or a map of where they want to go. They've got everybody saying, yeah, these are good ideas, but with almost nothing being imposed on the nation states at this point. The idea was to impose it. The original documents were forcing the nation states to pass laws that they would be ordered to by the WHO, et cetera, and they didn't get those provisions. But they did, all three documents support WHO imposing global censorship. So that's important. All of the nations are happy to censor their citizens. That was not a problem for them. Okay. I'm doing well. So people told you about farming, and I want to give you numbers. Since between 2017 and 2024, the United States lost 160,000 farmers and ranchers. These are small farmers and ranchers, and over 20 million acres were lost to production. What happened is that around 1970, we had a model under Earl Butz, who was Secretary of Agriculture, get big or get out. The idea is, and it's still true, that if you use the green revolution. With the green revolution, you use chemicals.
Anything but green, it's chemicals.
If you use fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and heavy equipment, you will be able to produce more per acre, at least for the time being. Sometimes that becomes a problem after a few years. And so that has been the policy, basically, of the federal government ever since then, is they deliberately tried to get rid of small farmers, and they think that will be more productive. And certainly food has gotten cheaper. So in the US, we pay less for food than almost anywhere in the world. But the food is of very poor quality, as you've heard. What I think and the Farm Bill and the laws and the regulations that manage how the United States spends many billions of dollars every year on farming, that they are completely complicated and crazy and impossible for any one person to understand all of them. And of course, this works very well for industry because, you know, what people wind up arguing about is, you know, how many pennies are you going to pay per pound if my crop fails? Or how much of the crop insurance, because everybody has crop insurance in case their crop fails, how much of that is going to be paid by the government and how much is going to be paid by the farm? And it's just, you know, you can apply for many grants, but it's a very complicated system designed, again, to hurt the small farmer, which is why they're going under. And I believe we need to get our agencies to really think big and get rid of this whole system and reinvent it. This is a graph to show you how many farms there were in the United States since 1850 to 2024. And you can see that the number of farms has gone down rapidly. The number of acres has gone down. We have less cattle in the United States growing right now than at any time since 1951. Now, it is true that the cattle are fattened up faster and that they are heavier than they used to be, but we still don't have enough cattle to meet the need. And you heard that 23% of our beef is coming from overseas. Beef prices have climbed to new records, and we don't have enough capacity to actually slaughter and process the meat, which is another thing that harms small farmers. I won't go into the details, but it's very important that we get that capacity. These things are probably not happening by accident. I talked to you about the World Economic Forum, the Bilderbergers, et cetera, at the beginning. These people have decided to make war on our food system. This is the World Economic Forum, taken right off their website. They plan to start us gently. Oh, we'll just make incremental changes to recipes. And then when everyone gets used to that, we reinvent the entire system top to bottom. The way society produces, distributes, consumes, and discards food. In other words, food will all be patented and made in factories. All right.
Soylent Green.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
And this was actually published in The Lancet If they do that, that you get people to model things, and you can model anything you want. So the Lancet got a group of people to model that the whole world could save $5 to $10 trillion a year if it transformed the food system and gave us ersatz fake food to eat instead of wholesome food, which people have eaten for thousands of years. You know it's good if they've been eating it for thousands of years and they manage to survive the weather and all that without electricity and everything else we have. So this tells you, this was conceived of as a world takeover. And it was an attack on our food, our energy, our laws, our public health. And we are, at the moment, defeating it in the United States. They are going under in the rest of the developed world. They need our help. We need to think of the problems globally, and our enemies have not given up. They have doubled down. Thanks.
Thank you, Meryl. So I wish we could talk for hours this afternoon. There's lots of food here, but I just want to thank all of you for all that you're doing. It's really a tremendous contribution. So thank you.